Hi, everybody. I'm Derrick Cartwright, and this is another installment in the Curator's Corner series. And today I thought I'd talk about a part of the Timken collection that's not so well known. I think I'm like a lot of people, and when I think about the Timken, I think mostly about its paintings collection, which is renowned throughout the world. And we're really proud of that collection. But there are other things at the museum. There are great tapestries, for instance, and there's also some sculpture. And so that's what I thought I would talk about today. So I'm going to share my screen and show you an image which you may remember, especially if you've been going to the museum for many years, as I think some of you have. This is an old view of the interior of the Timken Museum of Art. And one of the things you'll notice right away is the changes, if you've been recently, that have taken place since this photograph was taken. That lovely sort of Empire style table in the foreground of the photograph has disappeared, and it's now this very welcoming space. And the other thing notably that's different is that large sculpture that's in the center of the hall that welcomes you to the museum is also no longer there. And occasionally we are asked about what happened to that sculpture. And so one of the first things I wanted to do today is talk about it and put it into a kind of historical context where the decision to replace it might make more sense. So many people will recognize right away that that sculpture is related to the work of John Bologna, who was a late 16th century sculptor. Jean de Bologna was born in Flanders and then ultimately comes to Italy, where he gets this new name, Giovanni de Bologna, or John Bologna, as he's often called, and he becomes one of the most important sculptors of the late 16th century. And the work that he made that inspired the work that is at the Timken, I'm showing you an early version of on the right, sometime around 1580 or so. We know that Giovanni de Bologna, John Bologna, created a sculpture, maybe one of his most famous, with the title Mercury, which showed the god Mercury sort of in motion in this particular version that I'm showing you on the right, which comes from the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. He's lacking the caduceus, which he holds in his hand in the Timken's version and in other versions of this sculpture. This is a small scaled bronze of what Jean Bologna did on multiple scales, multiple sizes. So maybe his most famous was for the Medici Gardens in Rome. But the Timken also has a version after this sculpture by John Bologna. And I just wanted to point out that there are numerous versions, more or less related to the originals that John Bologna produced in his lifetime. I'm showing you, for instance, on the left of this slide, a version of Mercury from the Bargello in Florence. Also that sculpture, probably a later cast of it in the Medici Gardens in Rome, and then versions of it also exist at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. On the right, far right, I think I'm showing you the version that can be found at the Louvre in Paris, but there are examples in public parks in Mexico City. Throughout the world, you can encounter this, and many visitors were used to seeing a copy of this sculpture at the Timken as well. That idea to put the John Bologna's Mercury in the center of the Timken's welcoming space, that central hall, was an idea that Walter Ames, who was an attorney for both the Putnam sisters, who are founding sponsors of the museum, and for the Timken family. He had this idea. It was inspired by having seen a similar staging of a museum at the National Gallery of Art. So I'm showing you a view of one of the rotunda spaces at the National Gallery of Art with a similarly large version of John Bologna's Mercury installed at the top of a fountain. I think this version is about 6 feet tall, so it's got that same presence that the Timken's casting had. But the National Gallery of Art's curators will tell you this is a much later cast of John Bologna's work. In fact, some scholars think it might be as late as 1850 or so. So it's not a 16th century object. And I think it's a testament to the lasting popularity of this sculpture that it gets reproduced so many times. And it held its popularity really into the 20th century. And so what Walter Ames saw in Washington, D.C., was quite distantly related to John Bologna's original work, but he liked it nonetheless, and he found a very modest copy of it, probably a late 19th century, maybe even early 20th century copy of that masterwork, and had it placed in the central space at the Timken Museum of Art, where it stood for many, many years. I think not exactly from the beginning of the museum, but shortly afterwards, and really up until about 2016, 2017 or so, when we arranged to have it removed. And one of the points I want to make is that a popular sculpture like this would have been reproduced certainly in John Bologna's own lifetime. We know this, that there were several versions of it made, and it remains popular today. You can go on Amazon.com and buy your own small scale replica of this statue. And I'm just showing you, without having tried very hard, some of the many examples of copies of this statue, from small scale figurines that you could put on your desktop to works the same size as the National Galleries or the Timkens that you could put in your garden, and at prices from less than $100 on up to several $1,000s. So what happened was, thanks to Walter Ames, whose bust I'm showing you here, the Timken got a relatively affordable version of this sculpture, and it's occupied this central and prestigious place, I think, within the museum for decades. I think as the museum has contemplated ways to become more welcoming, to provide the kind of access that its audiences want, places to sit, things like that, that central space that had been designated for the copy of John Bologna's work became much more precious to the institution, and we decided that we would move that sculpture into one of the side gardens of the Timken, where it will eventually be set, and I think still have a place of some pride in the institution, but not that central place. And for me, it's also a kind of scholarly issue. This is a work of art, unlike all the other objects that you might find in the Timken, which is understood by most people to be a copy, and a distant copy from the original. And that's not what we think when we look at the Rembrandt. And so if we were to show a copy of a Rembrandt, I think many visitors to the museum would be disappointed that we had put it in such a place of prominence. But because Walter Ames was such an important person, because he played this leading role in the acquisition of the replica of John Bologna's work, we've decided not to discard it, but to always keep it and honor him in that way. Just as this bust, which some of you may recognize, is a kind of honoring of Walter Ames and his central role in the creation of the museum. That bust, and I'm showing it to you here, is a work that many visitors will recognize. It's often put in some proximity to the John Bologna, or was when that work was in the central space. It's the work of a San Diego artist, Ruth Hayward, who is known for her realist representations of key San Diego figures. So if you're a regular visitor to Balboa Park, you probably have seen her representations of Kate Sessions or George Marston, which I'm showing you here on the left. And so it shouldn't surprise us that when the Timken board wanted to honor Walter Ames, they found Ruth Hayward and asked if she would create this great likeness of him. And we're really proud to have it, and it will always be kept in the museum as a reflection of our respect for Walter Ames. But I've been trying, as I've planned projects over the last few years, to integrate sculpture more and more often into our displays. And so Walter Ames's bust made an appearance briefly, I should say, next to Jeff Koons's stainless steel statuette of Bob Hope in a show we did based on the Sonnabend collection just a couple of years ago. And similarly, we've shown Italian sculpture by artists as renowned as Ghiberti in the context of exhibitions. So these are ways in which I want to make the point that the Timken isn't just interested in two-dimensional objects, but three-dimensional sculpture is a really important part of art history too, and I think will always have a place at the Timken. As recently as last summer, we invited the contemporary artist Roman DeSalvo to create a sculpture in the central space. So that very space where the John Bologna replica once stood was home for the summer to Roman DeSalvo's really witty and I think beautiful sculptural installation, which he called Electric Picnic. And some of you who saw that will remember it as fondly as I do as this smart rethinking of the trees that are in the background of our great painting by Fragonard, which provided the inspiration for Roman's almost erector set-like construction in that space. And it was really an illuminating introduction to the Timken to have contemporary artists. And we'll soon again have Marianela de la Hoz playing a similar role as she is the artist in residence this coming summer. And the last point I wanted to make about sculpture at the Timken is for many years now, we've had this holiday ornament display, which was part of a long-standing relationship that the museum had with two great San Diego women, Florence Ford and Elizabeth Schlappe, who made these ornaments out of a kind of love for the materials and shared them with the Timken, and they've become really popular with the public at large. So whenever they're on display, lots and lots of people flock into the Timken. Maybe less well known to that audience is the really critical role that Florence Ford played in San Diego sculptural history. She was married to Donald Ford, who was really the sculptor of the city throughout the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s. Ford did the great statue called Guardian of the Waters, which stands outside the county administration building downtown. He also, at the time of the 1935 California-Panama Exposition, did this Woman of Tehuantepec, which is in the central courtyard of the House of Hospitality space, and which, as people queue up to go into the restaurant, provides this wonderful visual display. And I think is one of the things that I like best about San Diego is that it produced great artists like Donald Ford, who may not be known throughout the world, and certainly Schlappe and Florence Ford were not known throughout the world, but they produced these really winning objects that still catch our attention and are worthy of study. So worthy that recently the Timken accepted this very generous gift from Florence Ford of two sculptures by her husband. These two that I'm showing you here, which are later works. They're actually wonderful to see in the Timken because they date to about the time of the construction of the building. And right now they're on display in what we call the Members Lounge. So you won't find them in the galleries of the museum, but they're part of our appreciation for the art and architecture of San Diego in the 20th century, of which I think the Timken is a marvelous example of that mid-20th century modern aesthetic. And having works like this by Donald Ford to share with the public is a real pleasure. So that's all I wanted to say. I hope that this finds you doing well, healthy, and I hope I'll see you soon at the museum. Thanks.